In our description of what we're doing together today, we have used the phrase Raja Yoga, which is a commonly used phrase in the yoga world, but I want to speak about it as to what it means to me, so we'll be on the same page in our conversation. Yoga, the word itself, means union, and it's representing the idea of unifying all the different aspects of life and all the different aspects of our own nature. Yoga has come to mean yoga postures, but all that is how to harmonize the physical side of our house, of ourselves. We also have the mental, and we also have the spiritual side. So what we're looking for in the practice of yoga itself is how not to feel so divided and so pulled in so many different directions. Because if we think about what makes us uncomfortable in life, it's often because there are so many seemingly contradictory forces. We want to be successful in a career, but we also want to have a happy relationship. We want to spend time with our children, but the sheer intellectual lack of intellectual stimulation, of spending too much time with our children, makes us die to have an adult conversation. All of these different things happen in the same way. If children weren't children, we would know that they're totally mentally unbalanced. So it's somewhat tiring sometimes to be with their utterly unreasonable nature, but they're so cute. They're just a little bit cuter than they are aggravating, God set it up so it just tips the scale just slightly, which of course it has to. And of course we have our partners in life, our relatives, all of whom have fine qualities, but also have qualities that, if we had a choice, we would have them be different. This is how so many partnerships don't work, is that we decide that what isn't there is more important than what is. In other words, there's a lack of unity. Things have not integrated. We haven't sort of seen the whole picture. So that's the first meaning of the word we're using. How do we become integrated? I myself, when I was, just before I met Swami Kriyananda, I had dropped out of university after just 1 year. I went to a prestigious college thinking that the people there would be able to tell me something that I really wanted to know. And what I really wanted to know was the meaning of life, and I really wanted to know the keys to happiness. I had a very happy life. It was not like I had suffered and was trying to get away from anything, but I had this inner feeling that life had more potential than anyone around me was talking about. When I was a child, I used to think that all the adults around me actually had this profound understanding, and they just thought I was too young, and that a certain stage of life, I would picture this, they would sort of bring me into a room somewhere, and we'd all have a good laugh together, and then they'd explain to me this wise understanding of life, and then we'd all go forward in a much better way. As I grew older, I realized that was never going to happen, because even though the people around me, because I was very fortunate, were intelligent, they had high moral values, they were very good people, but quite honestly, they didn't know. They were just taking life as it was offered to them, and somehow that seemed to be enough for them, and it was desperately and completely not enough for me. And so when I went to university finally, and I was accepted at a good college, and I basically went because I was accepted, it was sort of like too great an opportunity to miss somehow. But I actually lost interest after 2 weeks, because I was in a class that I thought was going to be about the meaning of life, And in fact, it was just collecting a lot of people's opinions about the meaning of life. And we were going to be very careful not to make any decisions. We were just going to become very knowledgeable about what everyone else thought, as if anybody thought it, that was good enough. And I realized that these people were very intelligent. They were very skilled in fields that I wasn't particularly interested in. But the one thing I wanted, which the word came to me later, wisdom, they did not have. They had knowledge in abundance and intelligence in abundance, but not wisdom. Not how do you live that attunes you to what I knew somehow was the purpose of my life, which was joy. Happiness, I called it then, but I've elevated. Joy, bliss, those are the words. So I lasted a year, wasted a lot of my parents' money. I was too young to realize what it meant to waste that much of my parents' money. I had to apologize to them later, but nonetheless, that's what happened. And then soon after that is when I discovered, actually, Raja Yoga. First, I discovered that there were individuals on the planet, in the past at least, who really understood that this is the purpose of life, and that everything else that we do becomes sensible in relationship to some fixed point. And that fixed point, I understood, is the way that we're made, who we are. This is the ancient teaching of India, and the phrase that they use is, it's not Hinduism, which is what sort of the modern religion is, but it's the power behind that. Religion happens because some great saint or master perceives a higher level of reality. I mean, this is not uncommon in many fields, most notably Albert Einstein, who basically revolutionized science itself because of his understanding that what appears to be matter is actually vibrations of energy. And this was not something that he worked out laboriously, in a mathematical way. It was something that he looked at creation and he saw it differently. And this is what, actually, in truth, if we think even in our own lives, we will realize that there's certain points in time when the circumstances of our lives or the circumstances of the planet, they suddenly shift a little and we see them very differently. Isn't that so? I mean, falling in love is that same thing, isn't it? You're just here, you're on the planet, you meet somebody who seems nice, and then all of a sudden you have a realization that this is very, very, very different than anything you've been part of. And circumstances haven't changed exactly, but the whole world is different. And artists have that revelation. Songwriters will have that. Scientists have it. Medical people have it all the time. They just suddenly know something. Intuition is what we call it, but intuition on a massive scale. In the history of the Indian culture, over and over again, there have been great souls who had a revelation about reality and then shared it. And that revelation is on very fundamental questions. What really brings happiness to the human heart, and what really causes the human heart to suffer. And this is very different than what do we think of as pleasurable, what do we think of as easy. It's on a much greater scale than that, because every human life is filled with ups and downs. We have this idea in our mind about how we're going to make it work, but life is much more complicated than that, isn't it? There's a saying that up to the age of 40, you have the face that God gave you. And after the age of 40, you have the face that you made for yourself. Because up to the age of 40, we have this optimistic belief that it's all just going to work out. And then there's a certain point in human life where we begin to realize this is much harder than I thought it was going to be, and that I have to recognize that the process of success or failure is much, much different. And that's when our whole life, relationship to life begins to change. Well, the entire idea of what brings happiness and what brings suffering has become the path of yoga, because integrating all the positive and negative and learning how to work our way through it, union of all the different elements, it doesn't say, the ancient teaching of yoga does not say that we can make life always pleasing to us according to our ideas of what is pleasing. Nowadays there's lots of offshoots that say all you have to do is affirm it, all you have to do is declare it, and reality will conform to you. It sounds really good on paper, and it sounds really good in these very short reels on Instagram. But it's a lot harder when you try to live it, because it's fundamentally giving too much power to too limited an aspect of ourselves. Part of the confusion all the time is when I say I, when I say me, when I say I want this, I will do this. How many different levels are there within us, all of which can answer to the pronoun I? It's very interesting when a person talks about I, you almost always touch your heart, don't you? Very few people say I like this. We always say I, and we never say I. Because we know that it is this balance point of our feeling, actually, and our intellect. It works together, but it's the feeling that tends to compel us in one way or another. When I was at university, everything from the brain point of view was all in alignment, but it didn't satisfy my heart. Very simply, it satisfied my mind to be with very intelligent, knowledgeable, even well-known people in their fields. But the feeling that I was looking for, which is a sense of deeper understanding, it just wasn't there. And no matter how much it should have been, it simply wasn't. Well, in the integrated teachings of yoga, we're talking about mind, we're talking about body, we're talking about heart, and we're talking about spirit. And the word Raja means royal, king. And so the royal yoga is when all of the different elements come together. Body, mind, heart, and spirit. And it seems almost like a pipe dream that all of these elements can be combined together. But in fact, anything less than that always leaves us slightly dissatisfied. Which is why most people, as they get closer to the end and the beginning, don't expand in their consciousness. They begin to cut their losses and get a little smaller. My parents both died in their early 80s. My mother died 2 years before my father. She'd had Parkinson's, which is a very challenging experience. She had it for about 15 years before she died, yeah. But I want to comfort you by saying in about 3 or 4 years before she died, after she'd been struggling with this for a decade, my mother was a very sweet woman and a very dear mother. She really loved having children. I asked her once, what was the happiest time of your life? There were 3 of us. She said, oh, when you 3 were small and you belonged to me, which I thought was very touching. Another friend of mine, when I was friends with her son, and when we were all fully grown up, the pictures she kept of her children were still when they were like 7, 8, and 9, because that was when they were small and they belonged to her. And so my mother was a dear mother. But she didn't have a lot of discipline. Weirdly, my father was extremely disciplined, but unfortunately I took after my mother. My mother was not particularly disciplined, and she allowed her emotions to rule her. I remember in one circumstance, my parents tended to keep their adult life separate from the children. It was their philosophy of child raising. But for some reason, my mother had gotten really angry at somebody over something, and my father happened to have mentioned it. And I said the next day, how is she feeling? He said, well, at a certain point, a hard-boiled egg stops steaming, but it's still hard-boiled, which was, I thought, a very vivid way of explaining it. So my mother tended to ride the waves of her emotion rather than master them. So she said to me before the end of her life, sort of like this, I hate to admit it, she said, but this disease has been the making of me. And what she meant was she developed willpower, she developed discipline, she developed the capacity to put aside her preferences and do what had to be done. And I admired her for being able to admit that, because she did. She was a fighter, because she just had to be in that context. And because I know about reincarnation, I'm certain that that's what happened. So was it a curse or a blessing that my mother had that illness? Because by the time she died, she had transformed her character. And I think if she took the fine qualities she had and added a little discipline to them and a little willpower, she could live an even more satisfying and successful life. So was it a bad thing that she got ill? You see how confusing it gets? See, the biggest confusion we have in even understanding our lives is that we don't exactly know what the goal of the game is. If you don't really know what the rules are, you just pick up the ball and you toss it wherever you want to, and then say that you've scored. You know how children are. They just make up the rules as they go along. I have the ball, I've taken it, I've put it under the bed in my room, so now I have 10 points. Wait a minute, that's not exactly how the game is played. And then children will say, yes, it is. And to a very large extent, that's really how we live in the world too, isn't it? Especially because the majority of the world, of the cultures that we live in, and I've been around the planet a lot recently, pretty much everywhere it's pretty much the same. It's that you just establish yourself in some material way in this world. You establish yourself, if possible, with some compatible people around you that you feel, depending on your temperament, either you say the people I love, or you say the people who love me, or maybe you say both of those things, and then you sort of build your world around that. And of course you have to have money and all these things, so everything is focused that way. I don't know what it's really like in Finland. The USA has become, I want a phrase to use, almost comical in its infatuation with establishing yourself in a worldly way. Especially, I live in Silicon Valley, where it's exceedingly materialistic. At the same time, it's also exceedingly creative. People have enormous energy, enormous imagination, and actually, even though it's very money-oriented, people are extremely generous because most of the money is self-made, which means that people understand how the flow of money works. And so they're as willing to give it away as they are to earn it. So it's a very interesting place to be. But the obsession with, in elementary school, you have to choose your sport so that you can, be outstanding by the time you're in high school, so that you can get your college, whatever it is, because you're so good at this. And then you meet the right people, and then you have a job, and then you have money. And it's like, what happened to childhood? What happened to the idea that there are many options in life? It's just a one. And then, of course, what happens is when people in their about 30, they have nervous breakdowns because it was never given to them in any way, who are you? What gives you joy? And just the absolute assumption that if we get all these external things in order, then the happiness will be automatic. And then there were some of us, I being one of them, it's like, I think there's something really fundamentally sick about this whole system. And it's not that any of those things are not good. This was my favorite awful story from that period of time. There's a community right in the middle of this area. It's called Cupertino. It's named for St. Joseph of Cupertino, ironically. But anyway, it's a very upscale neighborhood. And it's one of these ones where everything is about building your resume for later in your life. And so some of the high school kids who were super smart and smarter than their parents in many ways figured out how to hack into the high school system, and this group just went in and changed their grades, made all their grades better. Yeah. And when they were uncovered, as somehow it happened that they were uncovered, everybody became more upset because they were not very embarrassed about what they'd done. And their answer was, nobody ever asked us if we were learning anything. Nobody ever cared whether we were learning. All they wanted was that we got good grades. So we found an easier way to get good grades. And to me, like, this was, a 5-star emergency, telling you what the real issue was. But I couldn't make any headway on it. So what I'm saying is, we're living in a time where if we try to think in terms of inner values or unique karma or even more genuine attunement to a higher level of consciousness, we're super swimming against the tide. And I don't think it'll stay that way forever. I think our global culture is coming to a crisis point in countless ways. You start with the climate, and then you go to the social changes and the enormous migration of where everything used to be really tidy. Little cultures would stay exactly the way they were, and now there's all this migration of people from completely other cultures moving in the U.S., people from South America and from different islands and from Asia are moving into what they call the heartland of the U.S., where all the residents have been leaving to go to more interesting areas. And so Haitians and Somalis and others are like becoming a dominant force in these extremely, what used to be white Christian towns. It's very amusing from the outside. And it's actually lovely. It's just everything is changing. We're not able to hold these little boxes that we had anymore. They're making us, conditions are making us think differently. And we've also run this thing so far of trying to find our fulfillment from outside ourselves that we're just reaching the natural end of it. And people of sensitivity or vulnerability, we're just having to ask different questions. And that's why the Eastern influence is coming in so strong, because those are cultures that have thought about life from the inside out. I'm not talking about modern India, and I'm not talking about Hinduism. I'm talking about the ancient teachings. And they ask simple questions. Who am I? Really? Like, how did I get here? And why? To me, it's like this. Every morning I wake up, and it's always me. I know other people just take this for granted, but to me this is very confusing. And I recognize it's also teetering on madness, so I pull myself back. But it's just like, why are you still here? Don't you have hobbies? Don't you have anything else that you can do? But I've always been me, as long as I can remember. And they tell us, all those wonderful people who die and then come back, they tell us that even when you take off this body, you're still there. And to me, this is a very compelling fact. It's like, what then? What am I really supposed to be doing here? If all of this, and even this body and this face, at a very early stage in my spiritual life, I realized that one of the things that constantly emphasized my identification with this limited form was all the mirrors that are common, in the ordinary home. And you walk into the bathroom just in the middle of the day and bingo, there you are again. And if you're a girl and a little insecure, you start wondering if you're okay, and you start examining whether your teeth are straight and whether your eyes look okay. So I realized if I didn't run into myself, I wouldn't think about myself all that much. And I developed the habit decades ago, is that I just cover up all the mirrors in my house. Now, in the Jewish tradition, when somebody dies, you cover all the mirrors. So when one of my Jewish friends came into my house and saw my mirrors that way, she just came out of the bathroom and said, "Who died?" I said, "Nobody, it's just my way." But there's so many things that are constantly reinforcing. But you ask the question, is this helpful or is this not helpful? In other words, who am I? A woman friend of mine who died of cancer relatively young, in her 40s. And she was a very dedicated yogi, very strong-minded, dedicated yogi. Her mother, herself, and then her sister all died of cancer relatively young, so she was not so shocked that it was happening to her. But she was in the last days of her life. And I mean, this is how people are. One of her friends came to see her and remarked, she's like a week away from death. And she said, "Your hair looks so cute like that." And the dying woman says, "I'm going to be the most adorable little corpse you ever saw." It's not, most people can't be that lighthearted. But can you imagine? You just this is how we think, because women are always trying to make their hair look good. And your hair looks really good. Oh yeah, that's a super comfort to me. But more seriously, she said, at the end, she said she was lying there and she said literally, thousands of faces were passing in front of her. And she said she realized every one of those faces had been her face in some incarnation. And she said the idea of clinging to this one in that context just seems so ludicrous to her. But what is it that we take with us when we pass? Is it now, this is a balance point, because this Raja Yoga does not tell us we should be passive in life. Many people use these teachings as an excuse not to be committed and not to put out energy. And because in the Raja Yoga teaching it says we need to be detached, people think detached means to just stand on the side and not participate. Fortunately, I have the example of Swami Kriyananda and Paramhansa Yogananda and every great spiritual teacher that there was. What you're detached from is the superficial side of what's happening, but you're deeply committed to the inner reality. And what that is what we're committed to is having the courage and the energy and the imagination to be able to see what the enduring principles are in everything that we're doing. That's why I was so frustrated in that college class when I wanted to know what is the unifying principle here. Even if all these people have different opinions, what are they all seeing? And then that comes to the question of, who am I? Am I just the temporary inhabitant of this body? And when this body is gone, then I'm gone. Or is there an enduring thread of awareness that goes all through it? And if so, what are the qualities of awareness that cause us suffering and bring us happiness? Is it the more I take from myself, the better I feel? I mean, that's the principle that is being followed all over the world now. The more I can get, who cares what the consequences are? We are living in an age, a paradoxical age, because on one hand there's ever greater evidence of the continuing reality both before and after this existence, and on the other hand there's a repudiation of the traditional dogmas that provided the moral fabric of our society, because people are interested in the energy of things, but they're not so much interested in some institution's definition of what we should do. So, organized religious groups are becoming more and more smaller and smaller influence. When I was growing up, you would never have a school activity on a Sunday morning. It was just assumed that every family would be somewhere in church. I mean, nowadays, where I live, the kids' soccer matches are on Sunday mornings as easily as they're on any other time, and nobody even thinks about it, because who goes to church? And you can see how church-going people are very upset about that, and others are not even aware of it, because we're not interested in dogmas. We're actually really interested in experience. But what is our experience? And this is where Raja Yoga comes in, with the practice of meditation, the philosophical understanding of reincarnation and karma and the chakras, the physical practices of yoga. Although meditation, even yoga postures, are meant to give us an actual experience of a reality other than this one. Meditation is a really simple practice in theory. It's a little challenging in practice, but it's very simple in theory. Most of the time, we're just getting our experience through the senses. We're looking around. All of you have your eyes open, mostly, and we're looking at each other. We're seeing each other's bodies. We're seeing this room. We're seeing the beautiful river out the window. We're hearing words. There's no incense burning, but if there were, we would be. And we're feeling with our physical selves the hardness of the chair or whatever it is, the little bit of cold on my nose or whatever it might be. And so we think of our existence as outward. Even little babies from the very beginning, the babies are what are they interested in? They're interested in everything around them, aren't they? Sticking their hands in their mouth, and there's the stage where babies will just take anything and put it in their mouths because they want to feel it in their hands, and then they want to experience it more, and they listen and they look, and we just keep growing up like that. That's why you go in the bathroom and you automatically look at your own face, right? And I just at least decided to cut that one off. But we're made that way. It's not a mistake. But when we meditate, what we're doing is, do I exist if I'm not getting my self-definition and my sense of reality from my senses? So meditation, as I say in theory, is very simple. We just stop doing what we habitually do, and we see what's there if we don't. We close our eyes, we close our ears, we still our body. Sometimes we use the sense of smell to enhance through incense, but it's because incense is a fragrance that is not a normal part of life. And then we see, if I'm not outward, what am I inward? And the implication is my body the source of my existence? Or is my body merely the way I express it? Now, I was giving a satsang at our community one Sunday morning, and in the far back corner of a modest-sized temple, there was a group back there. Let me think at that point. Maybe I've had LASIK surgery, so now I can see you all perfectly without my glasses. But in those days, I still wore glasses, and Swami Kriyananda encouraged us not to wear glasses when we spoke because the eyes are big communicators. That's why I had the surgery. But I think then I had my glasses off because there was this group in the back corner. It was very interesting. I couldn't see them clearly, but their vibration was unusual. I just didn't know what was going on until the whole service was over and I walked out, and when I got close to them, I realized it was a group of, I don't know what the proper word is now, Down syndrome people who were part of some organized activity, and every Sunday they would go to a different temple. And it was so interesting to me because their vibration was so different than anyone in the room. But when I looked at them, I realized the only thing that wasn't working was their brain. Nothing had happened to their soul or their spirit. It's just that they couldn't express themselves because their brains didn't work. And so it made a whole different vibration. But as soon as that brain was gone, They didn't have an impaired soul in any way. They were just had a certain karma that they were having to live through. So who are we? If our brains are working, does that mean we're working properly, or does that just mean our brains are working properly? Isn't that an interesting way to think about it? Yeah. So the fundamental question of Raja Yoga is, who am I? And if I am more than this physical world and the senses that I live through, how does that impact every single decision I make? And one of the things that's so interesting now is these death and return experiences. I talk about this all the time because it fascinates me. Because they come out of their bodies for a time, and they're still there. And you know, the movies now just illustrate it perfectly. The body falls down and the same actor gets up, you know. Except now they can walk through the walls and nobody can see them and all of that. And it's pretty darn accurate. Because my consciousness, the real picture is my unique karmic pattern. That's what we're working. There's this amazing aspect to reality, which is on one hand, we're all so much the same. And once again, I've had this deeply imprinted on me because I've been so many places where things are supposed to be so different. And after a few minutes, after you kind of get used to it, the accents or the movements, I saw this video, and I don't know the name of it. If anybody knows the name of it, you can tell me. It was a film about all these different places where Mother Mary had appeared, and all these different visionaries who'd had visions of Mother Mary, which it was just a beautiful film. And it was so interesting because each visionary from different cultures had different ways of doing it. And one of them, Mother Mary comes to Africa, seemingly quite often. There must be a lot of heart there. There's a lot more visionaries than we know about. And so there was this group of African women, and you know, they have such a great sense of rhythm and dance. And they were doing some kind of something that related to Catholicism. And when it came time, they went, just like that, you know, nothing you would ever see in some pious European, but it was just like, this is who we are. And when we feel the Spirit, this is how we say it. But it was the same Spirit, just exactly the same Spirit, but just coming through the unique qualities. And each one of us lives so much more in the filter of our own consciousness than we realize. That's why, much as we love each other, there's always that moment when you realize it's not a question of whether he or she really loves me. It's just that they are themselves and I am myself. This is why waking up every morning and finding her still there is so frustrating to me. You know, I mean, she's fairly good company, but really, enough is enough after a while. But this is what the saints and masters help us to do. We help to just recognize that we're all just moving along together. It's very interesting. I've lived in the Ananda communities now for all my adult life. In my early 20s I started. I've never lived any other way. And we're friends in the normal way. We're a very natural group of people. One of the reasons I like to travel with a small group is that it kind of gives everybody different examples. If I just come by myself, then you don't see so much the principles behind it. You just see one personality. But in our communities, we're friends on the level of personality, of course, because that's the way people are. But what really unites us is that we have shared ideals. And I realize this in the oddest way. Because our spiritual family has been together for many incarnations, as Swami Kriyananda put it, we've been all in all to one another, which means some of us we love and some of us we've been enemies, you know, in many lifetimes. So one of the women that I knew, especially at the beginning of my life in the community, was an old enemy from a long time. We managed, both of us, to get psychic readings or have psychic intuitions, and so we could really tell each other how horrible we had been in past lives. You know, and I was bad, she was bad. There was no way to make it look good. It was bad. And so we naturally, intensely disliked each other. That's the only way I can say. Literally, when I would eat food that she would cook, it would make me throw up later. Like, did she poison me in some lifetime? I don't know. But that was the level on which we functioned. All I can say is I was younger then. But one day I realized, as much as I disliked her, she was one of my best friends, weirdly, because we shared the same ideals. That was really what unifies us, is our mutual desire for self-transformation. And actually, we can spread this out in all directions, because what does everyone want? You know, how can a master or a saint be so sympathetic? Because they see beneath the superficial. We have this pattern of energy within us. It's called the chakra system. You can go to my YouTube channel and type in the word chakras in the question box, and I have many very interesting classes on this subject. I highly recommend them, because it's this energy pattern within us that really dictates both what we attract and what we can't attract to our lives, and why we react the way we react. I mean, think about it. If you have a lifetime in which you deeply desire something that never comes to you because the karma's not right in that lifetime, so you grow up with this expectation, and you live with this expectation, which may be fulfilled. And in the next incarnation, you're born with a pessimistic attitude. You know, this is never going to come to me. Or you have everything you want, and then there's a war, or a dictator, or a madman who comes through and burns your house down, and the people you love are gone. So even then, when everything looks positive in the next incarnation, there's always this memory back there that something hard is about to happen, and we don't trust. Now, is there any direction to all of this, or is it just a constant up and down and up and down? Many people just become very cynical easily. It's so easy to see how you would become cynical. And, or even more, you make yourself smaller. Because if I'm smaller, I'm less vulnerable. I mean, what I call the preemptive strike. You know, I just don't expect anything, and then I'm not going to be hurt. But the masters come in, and they come in with this wholehearted welcoming of everything that happens. And we use Jesus Christ as the most extraordinary example. Just walks into the most, what seems to all of us, the most terrible fate. You know, dishonor, physical torture, death. It just seems horrid to us. And yet he never hesitated. He didn't have to do that. He did it because he wanted to show us something. And then, of course, the emphasis on Christianity has been that he was crucified. I wish they had just chosen the resurrection instead. You know, otherwise you just see this horrible suffering all the time, and you're told that somehow that's the point. I remember going with Swamiji, Swami Kriyananda, to the Uffizi in Florence, and we were looking at a lot of the classical art, and we saw just painting after painting of Jesus being crucified, you know, in every possible way. And after we walked out, Swami said, I think it's time for a new theme. You know, I think we've just pushed that one about as far as we can push it. Resurrection would have been just as natural a conclusion from that whole experience. The whole experience would have been that the spirit triumphs rather than the spirit is defeated. The body can be defeated, but the spirit triumphs. How different that makes it. And also, it makes us think about what happens to us in a very different light. Because if we're building this energy pattern, if this energy pattern is who we really are, what matters is not what happens to us, but what matters is how courageously we're able to face into it. And where does that courage come from? You see, these are the real questions. These are the questions I wanted answered. And nobody at the university had even thought about those questions. Swami Kriyananda, when I met him, he he walked into the room, and I have many different ways of saying it because it was totally intuitive. It was not intellectual. I'd never seen him before. A friend, I knew the principles. I knew about Raja Yoga. I'd been studying, not really practicing, but studying for a few years, so I knew what he represented. But I'd never seen it personified. And so he walked into the room and he personified this principle, which is I inhabit a physical body, but I am the divine spirit within it. And that divine spirit is unconquerable. That spirit is joyous, that spirit is free, that spirit is fearless, that spirit, makes a mockery of the limitations that I was living under. There was nothing pretentious about him. In fact, he was slightly comical. One of my friends later described Swami. He was American, but he had lived in India. His guru was Indian. And at that time, he must have been dressed this way too, but my friend described him like this. He wore an orange dhoti, which is like a skirt, looks like a skirt, a sarong. He wore an orange Indian kurta, which is long like this, and then he wore a shawl around that kurta. He had his hair long at that time, but I think he usually pulled it back. Sometimes he wore it. He wore brown loafers, just like dress shoes, and regular dress socks like that. My friend said when he saw him, he was wearing a beret and an overcoat. So he looked like the United Nations, just walking in one form. And my friend commented, he said, "I like this man. He's entirely himself." So I don't think that Swami had on the beret and the overcoat when I saw him, but he was probably wearing the rest of the somewhat outlandish outfit for, California where we were. But he was entirely himself. He was wearing the body. He wasn't the body. He was just wearing the body. And he just walked in, and there was just this spirit in the room. And I just said, that's what I'm trying to become. I'm trying to become free. How did he get that way? And he answered the question, who am I? Where does happiness come from? And the answer was, it's a gymnasium is what I often like to think of. I don't go to the gym because it bores me to pieces, but I know that people do go to the gym and they go to get strong, and you go and you do all those exercises, and if you're lifting weights, you don't always choose a weight that's a little smaller than you can lift and then just show how strong you are. Every time you go, you put something just a little heavier on it. Isn't that so? Because it's not the doing of it that is the issue. It's the strength that you'll build from doing it. And yet in our life, when our karma puts something a little heavier on us, we feel so misused and so helpless in the face of it. But who am I and why am I here? And we're here to constantly come to a greater state of realization of my own power, of my own abilities, of the strength that I have within us, but not the I, this little ego self. That's the other half of the question. Do I exist as a separate entity, or am I an integrated part of creation itself? And when I say I, am I just my little brain? Or is there this greater reality in me that I access every so often in meditation, every so often in the company of souls that have energy that appeal to me, every so often when I hear music, when I'm making a painting, when I'm out in this beautiful natural world. Ramakrishna, who was a great avatar of the late 1800s, the story is told when he was 7 years old was the first time he lost outward consciousness in the contemplation of the divine. And there was a dark cloud in the sky, and a flock of white birds went across the sky like that. And the contrast reminded him of the dual nature of life. And just the perception of that black and white just caused him to rise into a completely different transcendent level, and his body fell to the ground. like that. I was actually, not too long ago, it was the other. It was a white cloud and it was blackbirds. And it was just one of those moments. I was out somewhere in a rural area and just these beautiful black birds across the white cloud, and I thought about Ramakrishna. Unfortunately, I didn't lose consciousness and fall to the ground. But just for a moment, and you all know what I'm saying, just for a moment, it's like, oh, there's something so entirely different going on here. My feeling when I met Swami Kriyananda and I began to learn about meditation and everything that went with it, it was like prior to that time, my life was very interesting. I had lots of energy, lots was happening, but I never knew which way was forward. You know, I was part of the 60s generation in California. I lived in San Francisco for a period of time during all of that. And, you know, I was not by any means timid or narrow in my ideas of what life could be. I was out there experimenting with the best of them, or the worst of them, depending on your perspective. No, I wasn't with the worst of them. I was sort of in the middle. But there was no unifying principle. The only unifying principle was the immediacy of the experience, which I was already smart enough to know was a pretty poor measure of what was good. You know, just it feels good in the moment, like, come on, there has got to be more than this. But when I really understood Raja Yoga, we are part of a greater reality. Our consciousness inhabits a body. It is not defined by it. Death itself is just a step along the way. Challenges are given to us, as Yogananda put it, not to crush us, but to awaken us to the divine power within. It's not what happens to us, it's the consciousness that we develop through those experiences, because that's what we take with us. Everything else is temporary. All of a sudden, I literally felt I had a pole star. You know, sometimes people I think they talk about Jesus as the pole star. It's very valid. The pole star is the fixed point of reference against which everything else can be measured. And I realized that's what I had always been missing, and I had been asking everyone, you know, what is the unifying theme here? And the unifying theme is my own consciousness and expanding it into greater and greater awareness of who I really am, which is bliss, which is power, which is freedom. You know, think how differently that makes us, because so much of what is suffering is fear that I'm not going to be able to deal with this, or fear that if I lose what I think I want, then what will become of me? In other words, an inability to generate from within us, you know, this higher level of awareness. That's why meditation itself is we close ourselves off from all that we're normally depending upon in order to discover an independent consciousness that can then be brought to bear on the circumstances of our life, rather than feeling always that we are helpless in the face of it. You see what a difference that is? So does anyone have a question or a thought they want to put into the story? Yeah, first of all, our society has a great desire. Culturally, we like to tear everything down right now. We are moving globally from an age of matter into an age of energy. This is what's described in Autobiography of a Yogi by Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda. The Yuga, the age on the planet, has been Kali Yuga. The nature of Kali Yuga, which means dark, is that everything is defined in terms of the form. We're now moving into the second higher age, going up, which is called Dwapara, which just simply means second. And that's a time in which we are defining things by the energy, not by the form. So in the age of Kali Yuga, which we're just coming out of, the Kali Yuga began to wane in 1700. It ended in 1900, and now we're starting into Dwapara. Dwapara is 24th 400 years old. I mean, long. So we're just really beginning. It's not generational. It's the planet itself has certain characteristics. As individuals, we incarnate on this planet or many others that we could choose that have the right vibrations for us. Because we have certain lessons we have to learn, we choose an environment that will allow us to learn them. If we need a planet that's in a dark age to learn our lessons, and bear in mind, Jesus was born in a very dark age, getting worse, because he was there with his disciples to bring light, and that very challenging environment was the right environment for them. We've all chosen to incarnate also in a very challenging environment because it is not supportive of the kind of spiritual life we're trying to understand. Also, the civilization on Earth, the global civilization, is essentially in conflict over those who want to hold on to the age of matter and those who are in tune with the age of energy. In the age of matter, things being defined by strict forms, religions are very clear-cut, cultures are very clear-cut, language is very clear-cut, race is very clear-cut. Black people stay in the black people zone, white people stay in the white people zone, Christians stay over here, Muslims stay over here, and everybody knows that they're absolutely right because nobody ever interferes with them. When the age begins to expand, we begin to move out. Part of what happens in the age of energy is that the increase of access to more subtle forms of energy makes it possible for us to travel and interact and communicate. So all of a sudden, where all those strict forms were just held because it wasn't really possible. You know, one bold adventurer like Marco Polo would go across the planet and come back and tell you about China and India. And in Europe, to tell a Marco Polo was to tell an outrageous tale of something that wasn't possible because what he brought back was so incomprehensible. Now, of course, anybody can just get on an airplane and go anywhere in the world and see for themselves how very different everything is. But because there is also this enormous conflict, and once we start thinking in terms of energy, we no longer care what the form is. We're much more concerned about what the actual experience is. So you discover that people with a different skin color, their energy is very much like mine, or people with a different language or a different culture, and that's why we're all scrambled up all over the planet right now. But part of that is because we've lost the security of fixed forms and the dogmas that they present. We're also reinventing and also very nervous because we don't really know what's true. And now anybody can just bring up any idea that they want. And out of self-protection, a kind of cynicism has also stepped in. Because we can't judge, especially now with the media and all of that, we have no context. Anybody can say anything. So because of the age we're on, people tend to default down. Instead of defaulting toward faith, defaulting toward trust and optimism, we're defaulting down. So, and somebody comes up with a good idea, like positive thinking is very helpful, be optimistic, and then somebody has the great fun of telling you why that's a terrible thing and not really a good thing. And also, there's a certain validity because people so we've lost our moorings. We don't have a relationship with a higher power, with lineage, with something we can trust. The institutions that we've trusted are all being discredited, and sometimes with very good cause, with corruption from money, from sensuality, from power. And so we're very cynical in the way that we're thinking, which is a very challenging age for people like us who are coming up into this understanding of this greatness, this freedom, this truth based on actual experience, not on some authority telling me what's valid. And so this is an age also in which we have to learn to rely. We can't rely on our own perceptions, our own intuitions, our own understanding of things. We cannot just feel secure that I'll just follow the rules of the Catholic Church and I'll definitely go to heaven. And that's basically the whole story. I shared in another room that I was in, a young friend of mine, when he was young, 5 or 6 years old, his parents sent him to Catholic school. The nuns, in those days, like one nun would be running a class of 50 first graders, which, she had to be one tough nun, is all I can say. So one of the ways she tried to coax the little boys to be good was she said, if you're a good boy, you get a bigger house in heaven. And for my friend, that was great news, because he had no interest in the size of his house in heaven, and therefore he had free license to behave any way he wanted to at that point. And on an adult level, to a very real extent, that's what's happened to our society. We used to have these institutions that told us what we couldn't do, and then we were safe. But now those institutions have lost credibility. We're working with our own energy, but we haven't yet established a new understanding, which must still be based on spiritual experience and spiritual authority, but not institutional authority. And that's what Raja Yoga, that's what self-realization is about. It doesn't mean that there's no fixed realities or no authorities. It's just that they're coming in differently, and their instructions to us are not dogma, and you'll go to heaven if you do this, and you'll go to hell if you do that. It's, why don't you try this and see what your experience is, which you see is very insecure. So people are always wanting to do what I call the preemptive strike. You say something, and then someone protects themselves by telling you, no, that's not true. And we are also always trying to find an easy fix. And that easy fix is, I'll just do this. I'll just be affirmative. I'll just say it's going to come out all right. I'll just say everything happens for the best, But it can become just as artificial as anything else, unless it's really based on our actual, where we stand, what we know to be true within ourselves. So we're not looking for either positive or negative. What we're actually looking for is authenticity and sincerity. Because in an age of energy, you have to be authentic and sincere, because it's your energy that matters. It's not you're sort of saying, I belong to this church, this is who we are, I belong to this race or nation or political party, this is who we are. It's not the label you put on yourself, it's what you actually are. So many people pick up the label, positive thinking is the way. If you're not positive, you'll attract the things that you're afraid of, all of which has truth. But the problem is people paste it on from the outside. The whole science of Raja Yoga, the entire reality is it grows like a seed. You plant a seed in the ground, it has to go through many, many stages before it reaches what its destiny is. But, the little apple seed, these are the many ways that I feel God's presence in the world. That little tiny apple seed has within it the capacity to become a tree. It's like, how do it know, And where is the power of an apple tree in that seed? It's so miraculous. Not different from us. Where is the power of a saint in each one of us? How do it know? But it does, because it's inherent. However, just as the apple seed has to go through every single stage to reach its destiny, so each of us has to go through every single stage to reach its destiny. And we get impatient. Oh, I'll just become this. And we paste it on top of ourselves. And it's not positivity that's toxic, it's inauthenticity that is toxic, or lack of sincerity. What are we, many, many, many times we are really afraid, and we don't want to admit or face our fear, So we try to find something to paste on top of it that will make us feel less afraid. But if it's false underneath it, not only does it not work, it actually undermines us because we start getting very confused about who I am, and we forget that this is an age of energy and that I can't just put on the right face and be the right person. Plus, this is my experience too from so many decades. People will try to, for example, you have some hard things in yourself that you want to that you have to face, and you don't want to face them. Understandably, we're fundamentally cowards. I don't want to have to admit what I'm afraid of. So instead, I will go to some place where they tell me I don't have to. I can just meditate and give it to God. And so then they will just pretend that, I don't have to deal with this. I can just pretend. And I've watched that it does work, because if you just keep meditating, keep practicing, you reach a point where suddenly it busts out, but you now have the strength to deal with it. Because you can't give it to God if you don't own it. If you're really trying to run away from having to deal with it and you're just hoping that somebody else is going to solve it for you, you have to clean house all the way through. So it's not that the principle is wrong, it just has to be applied intelligently. Because if you are not afraid of who you actually are, then bringing God into it and giving the fruits of your life to God and really asking the Divine Mother to help you solve this problem is tremendously powerful. To be able to be positive in the way that you approach things. Positive thinking is not to say that everything is fine and okay. Positive thinking is to say, there is a solution, I will find it, and Divine Mother will help me go forward. That's what real positivity is. Positivity isn't, there's no problem here, everything is just fine. And that is toxic because it's not true. That's the entire issue. It's not true. You have to just be in the truth of whatever is there. But all of these phrases, catchphrases, popular phrases, are just mental laziness, honestly, and emotional cowardice to a large extent. We'll just use some clever sounding phrase, and then we won't ever really have to deal with this. I also know it's helpful because it gets people's attention, but I'm very suspicious of too much trendiness, But I'm old. I can just stand here and watch it. Some of them are clever. Swami Kriyananda was never much for slang or clever phrases like that, but the one he really liked was the one that, because he thought it in terms of reincarnation, been there, done that. He liked that one. It was the only one I ever heard him use. Been there, done that. Yeah, I know that one really well. It was also interesting because he had such an expanded, refined consciousness that whenever he would use slang in any way, you would hear the vibration of slang, and it would be so dissonant with his vibration. I remember on one occasion, I don't know if it's slang that ever got to hear, but the phrase "the pits" means, I don't know whether it meant it was the armpit or whether it was the pit, but when something was really terrible, you would say it was the pits. And I remember Swami once, just something happened, and we asked him how it was, and with great energy, he drew himself up and said, it was the pits. He said like that. And it just sounded so funny when he said it, like that. But nonetheless, sometimes these phrases really do capture it. Toxic positivity is one I really don't like, even though I know what they're talking about and I understand the problem. But that one particularly, for some reason, I don't like it. I don't think it's helpful. Okay? Do we have another question? Yes. God, in English, has no specific meaning if you think about it. And that's why people get so confused. There's no, a church will define it for you, or a person will define it for you, but inherently, it just stands alone without anything to define it. Interestingly, in the Sanskrit language, Many words that are synonyms for the word God actually describe attributes. Ananda, which is the name of our community, Ananda is a synonym for God. It says it's bliss. Shanti is a synonym for God. It means peace. In the Bible, Jesus says, the peace with which passeth understanding, which means the peace that just comes over you for no reason. It's not like, oh my gosh, I finally put the baby to sleep and she stopped crying. Ah, it's so peaceful. That's not what's meant. It's something that just overtakes you. Ananda is the same. It's a bliss that has no cause and no end. And so if you say God and you say Ananda, then you know what you're talking about. At least whether you've experienced it or not, you know what you're talking about. Prem means love in the same way. We can use the word in English, love, but it means I love my new shoes, I love my puppy, I love my job, I love the view out the window. But prem means infinite, divine, unconditional love. So, because English is the only language I speak, we do use the word God, and it comes to mean something, but it carries attributes. The best synonym for God in the Sanskrit language is Satchidananda, which means ever existing, eternal, ever conscious, ever new bliss, which is meaning my consciousness is always there, I'm always aware, I'm not just passive, I'm aware, I'm experiencing bliss, and it's never boring because it's ever new. So if you say, I want to realize God, and you're talking about eternal awareness of ever-inspiring bliss, that's like something worth doing. And it's not a dogma, it's a vocabulary. Now, Divine Mother is a way of talking about a certain aspect of God, which is, if you think, and this is fascinating to contemplate, everything we experience on this plane of existence is actually a doorway, a symbol, a way of encouraging us to understand that everything that we love here expands and becomes ever more lovable. So when we think about love, the most selfless, in theory, not always in practice, unfortunately, but the most selfless kind of love is mother love. And I'm not talking about woman loving. I'm talking about the idea of mother love, which can come as easily through a male as it can through a female, but the symbol of it, the mother becomes pregnant, she sacrifices her own body, she makes the child's body out of herself. Once that child is born, there's this overwhelming willingness to just care for that child that never ends. And that love can be expressed by men or women, and it doesn't have to be biological children, but mother love is, what can I do to make your life successful? I'm not thinking about myself. So it gives us at least the potential to understand what perfect unconditional love could be. And the other aspect about mother love versus the way a father loves, and again, we have to take ourselves out of men and women. This is just the vibrations of the universe. The father is also a very essential aspect of life, because the father stands strong and says, you have to rise to this. You know, I love you, I sympathize, but you have to stand up and face this. The mother is always compassionate. And if there's not a balance between mother and father love, the child does not grow up strong. If when the father says, you must stand and face and be courageous, and the mother says, no, you don't really, you can see how it doesn't work. If the mother just coddles and there's no influence that says you can do it, then you can see how the child also becomes crippled. However, if the father only says you have to do it and there's never any comfort, the child also becomes critical like that. A friend of mine, he lived in the country place, and in the South, where they have a little bit of an accent in English. And his father was pretty darn tough. And he said every morning, at whatever time it was, 5 or 6, pretty early, his dad would come in, he would be asleep, his dad would take the blanket, pull the blanket off and say, "Rise up, son." And he said, it's just like that. He would always wake up. He had to wake up before his father came in. "Rise up, son." Fortunately, he had it was balanced. But I always think about that like, oh dear, from dead sleep, someone rips the covers off me. But the Divine Mother, no matter what happens, she comforts you. Interestingly, in the Bible, when Jesus was born, God was a very harsh judge. And so Jesus brought the people to understand that God was a loving Father. If you ask of your father a loaf of bread, will he give you a stone? The whole story of the prodigal son, where the child, completely wastes the privilege of the father, but the father still welcomes him back. Jesus was trying to say, because the image of God then was, God was so harsh, you break one rule, that's it, you're finished. But he said, after I am gone, I will send the Comforter. And Comforter was what, he couldn't talk about the Divine Mother because it was too far a stretch, but he promised them the Comforter. He was really talking about what we talk about, what Yogananda was able to say, because Yogananda came where the world already understood God the Father. So he could say, well, God is also the Mother, because God is not only that which demands of you, but also comforts you along the way. So I speak of Divine Mother because I like being comforted. It just appeals to me to be able to feel that, and I was fortunate enough, I have a human image of that too. My mother was a great comfort. And I know what that feels like in my temperament. I like being comforted. I don't mind being challenged, but I'd rather be in the arms of my mother when my father challenges me, if you know what I mean like that. So that's precisely what I mean. It's just a simple shorthand language way of talking about a certain attribute of the divine, which is not imagination. It's not like I'm making this up because it sounds good. It's exactly how we experience it. And for these times, Divine Mother is a nice balance. We're finally advancing enough where we can think of Father, Mother in exactly the same way. So when Yogananda would pray, Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, it would always be both, because both are necessary. And then one makes a decision in one's own heart as to where one wants to go with that.